What does it mean to be the nation state of the Jewish people? Of a prototypical indigenous people, the return to our ancestral homeland after thousands of years, that is committed to equality. Every part of that Declaration of Independence, and I like to use it because it enables us to actually not only understand the vision, mission, values that were anchored, they're there, but also enables us to identify from a positive perspective what are the conversations that we can be and should be and must be having, including the reclamation of Zionism.
Hi, and welcome to the Z3 podcast. I am Amitai Fraiman. I'm the director of the Z3 project, and this is our podcast. In today's conversation, I interview and have a conversation with former member of Knesset, Michal Cotler-Wunsh. She is Israel's special envoy to combating antisemitism. And then we cover kind of the arenas where this is playing out today and part of the plan to address it. It's an interesting conversation. It gives us also a sense of the moment we are in and how dire it is, and also some moments of hope in anticipating what can be done and how to think about this moment as a community and as individuals. We hope you enjoy this conversation. Please follow us on our various platforms. We're on Facebook, we are on X, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and LinkedIn, and enjoy this episode. So, Michal, welcome to the Z3 podcast. It's such an honor to have you here as a guest.
Thank you.
It's really, I know it's a difficult time for our people, but it's really, as much as you can say it, I'm excited to have you here because I think that, and we'll hear more about it in a minute for our audiences, but to hear about your role and what you're doing and your mission and what you're trying to achieve in this moment of facing the Jewish people here in the diaspora and in Israel is going to be incredibly, hopefully inspiring, and also giving people some tangible ideas of what's happening on the ground, because I think there's a sense of loss of where to go and what to do. So just for the sake of those who are joining us for the first time, this is a Z3 podcast. We try to have conversations here that are a little, extending what we do in our annual conference and having the opportunity to dive deeper with, leaders from across the Jewish world to really hear about their work. So it really, again, I'm honored to have you here with us. And
I appreciate being here. I think it's a really existential time. I think it's an existential time for the state of Israel, for the Jewish people, and actually, from my perspective, for civilization as we know it, for democracy. And I don't like to be overdramatic, but I think that 10/7 marked a very, very clear line in the quicksand. So you have to pay attention in that it removed many, many masks that leave people in many ways sort of homeless, where rugs were pulled under people's feet. They thought that they understood the space that they are living in, the friends that they have, the places in which they work or study. And 10/7 ripped off multiple masks. So those of us that have been in the world of monitoring and combating anti-Semitism and understanding the mutation of anti-Semitism perhaps could have predicted many of the manifestations. But even, I'll say, for us, and in this role as Israel's Special Envoy, actually getting on the plane the first time, 10 days after 10/7, it was clear to me that we were going to see a tsunami of anti-Semitism. Now, that's mortifying and almost unfathomable. Here we are marking the day in which the worst atrocities perpetrated against the Jewish people since the Holocaust, and we're about to mark International Holocaust Remembrance Day later this week, the worst atrocities perpetrated against Jews. And it was, for those of us in this line of work, if you will, it was actually quite predictable that what we would see is a response, not in the intensity and not in the speed that it came. So the very same anti-Semitism that fueled the atrocities, the war crimes, the crimes against humanity by a genocidal terror organization on 10/7 was the anti-Semitism that fueled the responses to the atrocities, to the war crimes, the crimes against humanity, that were silent, that denied, that justified, that supported, and that attacked Jews in the wake of 10/7 on university campuses, on the streets, online. And so I think that we are at a really historic existential moment, and it's very important that we have these conversations at this moment.
Yeah, certainly. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. I think before we jump into it, I think it would be helpful for some of our audiences to hear a little bit of I'd say your professional kind of background and personal, as much as you feel relevant. But I think it will not only ground the expertise, which is one piece, but also I think that what I find troubling in this moment is that everything is so dehumanizing across the board. And I think that if we are able to at least, when we're listening to experts and people who are professionals in this, to remember that there are humans behind it, it makes it more personal and relevant and useful. So I'm curious, how did leading to this role?
How did you come to this moment? Yeah. So I'll say my own personal life story, I think very much really prepared me for precisely the moment that we're in. I say that with broken heart because we should have never imagined being in this place again. But I am a product, actually on a positive sort of side of that, of being sort of a bridge between Israel and global Jewry. I was born in Jerusalem. I grew up in Montreal, Canada. I emigrated to Israel. I served as a lone soldier. I went to law school in Israel. I moved again to Montreal, Canada, where I had my own children and raised young kids, and then back to Israel about 14 years ago. 3 of 4 of our kids are in the army, serving right now as we speak. It's this constant sort of cavity in the pit of your stomach. There's no other way to describe it. And in many ways, I think that what that enables is not only to see Israel from the inside out, but to see Israel from the outside in, and not only to see global Jewry in whatever community, and each community is a little different, but also very similar, to see each community not only from the inside out, but also from the outside in. So that is the first piece, I think, that brings me to this moment and the importance or the understanding of the importance of our connection as a people, which is what we are, right? We are not just a religion, we have a religion. We are not just a culture, we have a culture. We're not just a country, we have a country. What we are is a people. And that connection, I think, has guided me right through my own lifetime. Actually, I'm very, very lucky to have, in the form of my own parents, real role models. So having been deeply not only engaged and raised in a home where Soviet Jewry was an incredibly important manifestation of what I just said about peoplehood and about human rights. So my own father actually was, at the time, Anatoly Sharansky, now known as Natan Sharansky's lawyer. But beyond that, Ida Nudel, and meaning the idea that the last time that the Jewish people actually, in our lifetime at least, had this common cause that united us as a people was very much a part of my formative years. And on top of that, or even before that actually, my mother was the parliamentary secretary for the Likud party. For Gachel, then the Likud party. So on the night of what's known as the overturn in Knesset, when Likud sort of won and Menachem Begin became prime minister, I was a 7-year-old, now how old I am, a 7-year-old little girl sitting, in Knesset. I was sort of the entertainment. And I think that that's important also because of the deep appreciation, not only for democracy and for its 3 branches, critical branches, but also for the fact that it's a young democracy. I'm not that old. And I was there for very important moments. I'll share one more piece of my own life that I think intersects with the moment that we're in, and then we'll talk a little bit about the professional and academic part. But my first memory as a little girl is actually from the 1973, the Yom Kippur War. I was living in Israel with my mom, and that is my first memory as a little girl. Not only the blaring sirens, but the feeling of existential challenge, which when I'll share the story of 10/7, I can't but connect the 2 sort of dates or days of that sense, and also the understanding of our imperative for unity if we are to overcome our challenges. From a more professional sort of background, not only, and I mentioned law school and my master's in law, and doesn't only focus on international law and human rights from that perspective, but actually as a legislator, and I am a former legislator, I served in Israel's Knesset, the understanding of what we face, not just in terms of the theoretical relationship between the 3 branches of government, but what is the importance of the role of legislators as lawmakers. And in the case very specifically of anti-Semitism, I'll say, I spoke about the international law human rights piece. In many ways, it is the co-opting and the weaponization of international law and of human rights that have enabled and almost fueled the mutation of the strain of anti-Semitism that we see. And when I say that, I mean decades-long process that has enabled that. So the 1975 Zionism is racism, UN resolution, Soviet propaganda that in the name of progress is alive and well on university campuses is something that we would be remiss if we didn't pay attention to. The 2001 Durban Conference in Durban, South Africa, against racism that turned into an anti-Semitic hate fest, after which the next blood libel, if you will, of Israel's an apartheid state became mainstreamed on university campus with Israel Apartheid Weeks. This is 23 years of Israel Apartheid Weeks across campuses around the world and certainly in North America. And the third sort of understanding, which troubles me very, very deeply, is the co-opting and weaponization not only of international law and its mechanisms created, whether it's the UN or the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court or, and I can go on, the Red Cross and so on, but actually the terminology that was created in order for the rules-based order created post-World War II to be able to uphold our shared commitment to never again. And I speak very specifically about the weaponization of the Holocaust itself, of genocide, a term coined by Raphael Lemkin post-Holocaust in order to describe the atrocities too terrible to imagine but not too terrible to have happened, and appropriated in this Orwellian inversion of fact and of law just last week at the International Court of Justice in the allegation by South Africa that it is Israel perpetrating a genocide, even as what we know happened on 10/7 by a genocidal terror organization that is committed to the annihilation of the State of Israel and murder of Jews like Mein Kampf was the making of, well, definitely war crimes and crimes against humanity, and the making of genocide in its intentionality to eliminate an entire people or entire group. That to me is of the most disturbing, and as I said, that has been my sort of professional academic expertise. That coupled with my own academic research actually with regards to regulation of speech on university campuses and how that affects, or does it affect, freedom of speech. I believe that we're seeing many manifestations of that. When I began my research, we were at the stage of speech codes, microaggressions, trigger warnings, safe spaces, and it occurred to me already then that this is going to adversely affect not just free speech, but also academic freedom, and here we are. And the last piece, and I mentioned and touched upon it as legislator, the understanding with regards to what we saw on 10/7 and thereafter is the online reality. So the understanding that what happens online does not remain online, the understanding that not only does it not remain online, but its global nature actually can spark manifestations on the street with real-world violence and real-world harm, and the understanding that anti-Semitism peddled online that led me actually to the creation of a nonpartisan interparliamentary task force to combat online anti-Semitism. So if I had to describe the sort of three fronts where this unconventional war for public opinion has been raging for decades, the international institution or mechanism space, the university campus space, and the social media space, the intersection of those multiple fronts on 10/7 and in the aftermath or in the responses to 10/7, I think basically brought me to this position, and I was appointed, by the way, 3 weeks before the war, enabling me, not only enabling me, but actually calling me to action and a tremendous sense of responsibility and urgency. You can hear it in my voice, because I do believe we're at a historic existential moment, to be able to hit the ground running and engage those three fronts, the international institutions and international law, the university campus space, and the online spaces, in not only what enabled the atrocities of 10/7, the burning and the rape and the murder and the mutilation and the abduction of thousands, all violations of international law and the rules-based order, that have gone with silence and denial and justification and support and attack of Jews around the world. And that response has been my primary cause for getting on planes, and this is my 7th emergency trip, actually 6 of them to the United States, with a recognition that we are at this intersection of tremendous challenge, but also incredible opportunity, and perhaps at a historic first, which in 1943, 10/7 occurred in 2023. 1943 or 2023 is not 1943. We could have only imagined having a state, a defense force, sovereignty, and half of us in that country to which we as a prototypical indigenous people returned after thousands of years of exile and persecution, and the other half in relative safety, maybe less comfortable than a few months ago or a few weeks ago, but nothing really changed. It was just percolating below the surface and erupted above it on 10/7. And the understanding that that relative safety and security enables us, for the first time ever, half of us in Israel and half of us in the rest of the world, to function in a united way to push back on, possibly for the first time in history, while rising from the docket of the accused and saying, absolutely not. You have appropriated our identity as an indigenous people. Our Zionism is an integral to our identity. That doesn't mean all Jews have to self-define as Zionists or all Zionists are Jews, not at all. But certainly those of us that choose to self-define as Zionists, and actually we do know that the majority of Jews self-define as Zionists, deserve the very same equal and consistent application of any infrastructure, whether it's in the international arena, in international institutions, the Red Cross, the UN, and so on, whether it's in the university campuses, in the DEI spaces, whether it's in the social media spaces in which there are protected characteristics that are applied to everybody except for Zionists, and reclaiming that identity has become more critical than ever, and knowing that the other half of us in the rest of the world are able to reflect back to Israel, that nation state to which we returned after millennia of exile and persecution, how it is to relate to other allies across difference, enabling to really, at this moment of existential challenge, to transcend and reach across differences, real or perceived, of politics, of denomination, of religion, of geography. And so we're at that moment of challenge and opportunity, and I think that Zionism has a lot to do with it.
Amazing. I mean, I'm like taking it all in. There's so much to pull on there. I'll start with the closing statement there. I think and very much resonates with what Z3 does. One of our tagline is reimagining diaspora-Israel relations. We start with diaspora because that's where we are, not because of, right? But our one of our key statements is exactly that point. For the first time in Jewish history, really, that we have both. Each has its challenge, both as in centers of Jewish life that are thriving, and successful with all its challenges. It's not, nothing's perfect, but that gives us an opportunity that we've never had before. And so what I find, I 100% agree that this is an existential moment for the Jewish people. And I think that what I find encouraging, and I don't know to say if this is like a first time in this sense, but I am hopeful that Israel, as a nation state, when it appoints an envoy, a special envoy to do this, and you've spent so many times, just in the past 3 months, 7 times on the plane, recognizing the role and responsibility that we have towards each other, right? When 10/7 hit, American Jewry mobilized and sent $500 million within weeks and more, right? Since, for sure. And there can be a conversation about, is that what we need in this moment, or is it something else, perhaps, a doubling down of what's happening here because of all the challenges? But regardless, that shows still that there's a sense of mutuality, and the idea that now Israel is assuming responsibility, I think I think it's an internalization of this moment. And what I'd like to hear more about, I think this is really what I'd like our audience's takeaways to move towards, okay, so what does that actually look like, right? I mean, having the right person and prioritizing it is an excellent first 2 steps, probably. But then, okay, so now what? So now what do we do to come up?
So first of all, thank you. But I don't just think it's about this specific role. I do think, and I agree with you 100%, that this role is very, very important in the sense that, and I'm not sure if everybody knows, but there are about 30 special envoys for combating anti-Semitism. The United States has a special envoy, Canada, many countries in Europe, many, many countries, and that's devastating. That means that many, many countries have recognized this gradual increase before 10/7, and now this tsunami of increase in anti-Semitism, recognizing the need to appoint a specified individual that will be committed to combating anti-Semitism.
But is this that Israel has one?
This is actually the second time.
The second time.
It's the second time. So the previous special envoy for combating anti-Semitism was Noah Tishby. She was appointed by the previous government. And this is the second time, and I think that this is actually one of the most, and you've hit it on the head, one of the most important manifestations of the fact that I said that mouthful before. By the way, that's the Declaration of Independence.
Right.
Israel as the nation state
yeah.
of a prototypical indigenous people returned after millennia of exile and persecution, committed to equality. Anecdotally, actually, on the last day of the Knesset that I was a member in, on the last day that it dispersed, my basic law declaration of independence was supposed to, be upheld for a first reading, and that didn't happen. But I think that actually, and I share that with you because I think that it leads me into the importance of recognizing the role of our generation. So yes, this role is critical in terms of assuming responsibility of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. There are many other manifestations of that recognition. Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. That's just the first sentence of that Declaration of Independence, or the first sort of anchor, pillar of the Declaration of Independence. What it also means when I speak about the Declaration of Independence is actually, and in many ways, it breaks my heart that we had to endure such devastation in order for so many other people to recognize the importance of this. But I believe, and I agree with you, that there is hope in this. And it is that not only are we possibly the first generation in Jewish history that has the opportunity to lean into this conversation, not from only what Rabbi Soloveitchik called the covenant of fate, which, yes, we have faced anti-Semitism or Jew hatred that is an ever-mutating virus for thousands of years. It has mutated for as long as Jews have existed, right, for thousands of years. But not only to enable, I guess, hate or the outside identify what it is that our shared destiny, if you will, that's why the destiny of the covenant of fate, but rather the covenant of destiny. I think that the idea of the covenant of destiny has to come from a place of relative safety. So the existence of the state of Israel, the 75-year young state of Israel, and I will continue referring to it as that because 75 is very young. And we would be remiss if we thought that we are done in this shared project of the Jewish people in returning to an ancestral homeland after thousands of years. And in 75 years, we're done, we built it. And what I like to share with people is, you know, when you're in Israel and you're driving around, and it is beautiful and it's remarkable what we've managed to do together in 75 years, apropos including what happened post 10/7 in sending that immediate sort of gut response of sending, of collecting what's necessary, whether it's money or tactical gear or everything else that was going on the ground. The understanding that what we have built in terms of the physical infrastructure is just the first tier, if you will. It's the first layer of building that shared project. And we're not done. And what this enables, including this conversation, which I think is a big part of it, is to take responsibility for the construction of the next tier. Call it the values or the moral tier. What does it mean to be the nation state of the Jewish people? Of a prototypical indigenous people, the return to our ancestral homeland after thousands of years, that is committed to equality. Every part of that Declaration of Independence, and I like to use it because it enables us to actually not only understand the vision, mission, values, that we're anchored, they're there, but also enables us to identify from a positive perspective what are the conversations that we can be and should be and must be having, including the reclamation of Zionism, and what it means that, and I guess here we veer into that covenant of fate, of being defined by the outside or by hate, if you will, of what it means that we've been exposed, if we're paying attention to the mask that was brutally removed, to the new or modern, mainstream, mutated strain of anti-Semitism. I said it's an ever-mutating virus. That is anti-Zionism, or the negation of Israel's very right to exist. Because 10/7 was so raw in so many ways, and what it clarified for those of us that might have gotten lost along the 75 years was, it's not about 1967, what happened on 10/7. It's not about land. It's not about whether you call it the West Bank or Judea and Samaria. It's about 1948. It's about our very existence as a country. And the fact that it enabled us to be reminded that anti-Zionism is the new, mutated, mainstream strain of anti-Semitism. I know it because when I come to speak about anti-Semitism, even before this role in law schools across the United States, I am met with demonstrations that are anti-Zionism. And so very often I could just throw away my speech and say, you know, I was going to talk to you about the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. By the way, the result of a long democratic process that has been adopted by over 40 countries, by over 1,200 entities, including the United States of America, that is critical at this moment, post 10/7, because it is the only definition that enables us to identify and combat the strain of anti-Semitism, which was revealed in the responses to 10/7, the demonization, the delegitimization, and the double standards that are singular to this benchmark definition. We use it as a coalition of special envoys, but I think it's a critical resource. And when you think of that IRA definition of anti-Semitism, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, what it actually enables us to reflect on is how we got here. So from the international law perspective, I shared some of the, Zionism is racism. We turn Zionism into racism, Israel into an apartheid state that perpetrates a genocide. Well, racists have no right to exist. Apartheid states have nothing to do with them but to dismantle them. And anyone who perpetrates a genocide does not have any protection of any of the international rules-based order. We understand how we got here to this moment. But what it demands of us is to say, these are blood libels. They're modern-day blood libels, which went unanswered, or were enabled by false moral equivalence, or were enabled by silence, or were enabled intentionally by mechanisms that utilize them. The UN that singles out the state of Israel systematically and regularly, as everybody knows here. And in many ways, I think that this post-10/7 moment, I mentioned before that it's an existential moment, but it's an existential moment in which we can, if we are capable of identifying what the removal of masks has actually exposed, and returning to the idea that we have a shared project, and maybe we refashion that shared project now that half of us are here and half of us are in Israel, or a little more than half in Israel and a little less in the rest of the world. Refashioning that shared project and taking collective responsibility, understanding that we are one side of the same coin. We're not even two sides of the same coin. One side of the same coin that has to, at this point in time, lean in to this incredible opportunity. As I said, I view it as a historic opportunity of a generation that recognizes post-10/7 that we have to reclaim what is rightfully ours, identity, at a time that everybody gets to self-define their identity, and ours has been defined for us. Ancestry, heritage, really at a time where even DEI infrastructure, when it exists, I don't have a problem with diversity and inclusion, equity, although I prefer equality personally. We can talk about that another time. I don't have a problem with DEI infrastructure so long as it's afforded to everybody equally and consistently, including David, who happens to be a Jew, or Margaret, who happens to be a self-defined Zionist, or Sue, who just thinks that Israel has the right to exist. And that understanding that we are, for the first time in history, in the position where we just can demand to be equally treated, not just as individuals who were barred from equal treatment in society with traditional anti-Semitism, if you will, but as an equal member in the family of nations, barred from that equal place in the family of nations. And that's all we're asking for. Not being held up on a pedestal, not being held up to a double standard, and not enabling a false moral equivalency between a democratic country and a genocidal terror organization. And again, this was revealed in the responses to 10/7 that we see daily manifestations of a genocidal terror organization, of a murderous Islamic regime that does the exact same thing to its people, murders and rapes and abducts. That is an unbelievable manifestation. I was even surprised by the speed with which, and I guess I shouldn't have been surprised, we moved from, that's not about Palestinian rights or social justice, that is support for Hamas, an openly genocidal terror organization that in its charter is committed to the murder of Jews, annihilation of Israel. And not only that, is but one proxy of a murderous regime that clearly stipulates, that's the great thing about authoritarian regimes, is that they mean what they say and they say what they mean. You could just read Khamenei's tweets because Twitter hasn't adopted, or X hasn't adopted IRA, so it's all right there. Zionist coding Jew. He calls regularly for the destruction of the Zionist cancerous entity that is Israel. So here we are at this moment where I guess that sense of urgency to also make accessible to those on this side of the pond, if you will, that none of us are alone. Meaning, whereas Israel is on the front lines, and it's very, very concrete because people are dying every day, and we are burying more of our friends' kids and more of our kids' friends than we've even begun to process. whereas we may be on the front lines and the entire Israeli population is deployed, so the entire country is on the front lines, the war that is raging in Israel is not going to remain just in Israel. That is just the front lines. And what we have in our sort of collective memory is the understanding that while it may begin with the Jews, it doesn't end with the Jews. And for the first time in history, we're experiencing that with sovereignty, with a country, with the ability to defend ourselves, or as I said at the UN, the never again for us is never again are we going to wait to be saved. Never again are we going to wait. We just marked 82 years to the Wannsee Conference, the final solution. We hear terror organizations and their state-supporting countries actually speaking the same final solution words from the river to the sea, from the north to the south just yesterday. The idea that there would be a call for a final solution that would ultimately end up in a Holocaust, and we're going to mark on Saturday International Holocaust Remembrance Day, it took the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the murder of 6 million Jews to liberate Auschwitz-Birkenau. So never again for us means something very concrete. And never again for the rest of the world, that's our role, to make sure that we clarify to our allies and expose those of us that we thought were our allies to say never again silence of women's organizations, never again silence of children's organizations, never again silence of all of those that we stood by for social justice causes. And all of a sudden, the social justice causes don't apply to Jews/Zionists/supporters of Israel. And again, the reclamation of all of that, for me, comes back to us reclaiming our identity from a positive perspective, and brings us right back to Zionism at the end of the day.
So that's incredibly helpful, and I find that articulation very, very inspiring. And I think that a lot of people are asking that question about identity and reclaiming and owning. And I think that part of what we do, this is why it sounds like, it feels like, that this is also like, these are the questions I'm going to ask because it fits in right. But like our work is about, we're not asking for permission to exist anymore. And I know that, like, I know what we do in that space, but I am curious. So you mentioned like working with the Coalition of Special Envoys and exposing and talking about like the roots of this and tracing it back to, this manifestation of a 2023-year-old anti-Semitism, basically, this new iteration of it. But I think that some people are like, on the ground, like, okay, but tachlis, like, what else? You, Michal, can't solve everybody's problems, right? But like, your mandate is to go and instigate these things and start and get the ball rolling, if it's locally or nationally. And I think people are very eager to hear, okay, but like, is there a plan beyond the intention, or is there concrete things that we can do even to kind of start? If there's the three arenas, if it's university, media, right, and now we said new media, university, and the law, the legal thing. Yes, right. So what are we doing here? What are we doing in the legal front, right? The UN, the special mission of the UN they're doing this thing, and we have in the court we have representation. Great. On campus we have students. New media, you mentioned that you had like this a task force. Like, what are some things that are happening or that you're going to push forward to?
So look, in the role of Special Envoy for Combating Antisemitism, I begin, and in the middle too usually, and end every single meeting. It doesn't matter if it's with university presidents, including those that appeared in Congress at that hearing. It doesn't matter if it's with the second gentleman regarding the White House strategy or any other strategies for combating anti-Semitism. It doesn't matter if it's with the social media platforms with whom we've engaged ever since we founded that task force. And actually now, in many ways, I hope that the special envoys will continue the work of the Interparliamentary Task Force as well in engaging the social media platforms and holding them to account. And I begin and end with the first very clear understanding in this role that in order to be able to identify and combat something, you have to first define it. You cannot identify something without having a definition, and you cannot combat something without being able to identify it. And in order to be able to identify and combat this strain of mutated, mainstream, modern anti-Semitism that is anti-Zionism. First of all, we have to say it, right? That is anti-Zionism, the negation of Israel's very right to exist. We have to own that.
Yep.
And that's a first big challenge that actually when we engage in these conversations, I am hoping to speak to Jewish communities around the world in order to be able to address that challenge that many people feel with what I've just said. And they're legitimately going to ask me many questions, and I have many answers for all the many questions. But first, we have to be able to say wholeheartedly, together, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. That is this new mutated mainstream strain. Now, viruses post-COVID, we're all experts. We understand that when you inoculate only against the older strains, the traditional, just the Holocaust denial kind, or blaming the individual Jew for something that Israel does, all part of the IRA definition, actually, because there are many manifestations or examples of how this hatred has evolved over time. We said it's such an ancient hatred. If we're only going to be able to inoculate, if you will, our societies, our spaces, our legal mechanisms against the older strains and allow this current strain, we know post-COVID, of a virus to run rampant in our spaces, it's still going to infect our entire society, campus, social media spaces. And therefore, IRA is where I begin and end every conversation that I have, from legislators to university presidents to the social media platform decision makers. Because what I've made very clear is the IRA was created as a resource precisely for the reason of what I've just said. It's not a legally binding resource, by the way. You can't send somebody to jail because they violated the IRA. It is an educational resource to say, I'll say this anecdotally, it makes it easier. During COVID, when I began the task force, there was really, really crazy anti-Semitism, including a COVID-48 hashtag and all kinds of other. And I engaged with TikTok at the time. It's another conversation, but TikTok educating 16 to 24-year-olds essentially are receiving, as we know, all of their information. Gen Z from that TikTok generation also believe that the state of Israel doesn't have a right to exist. We have a problem. And TikTok disseminated bin Laden's letter to America post 10/7. And if you can deny, justify, support, and attack Jews in the wake of 10/7, why not 9/11? And guess what? That's precisely what happened after the dissemination on TikTok of bin Laden's letter to America. Bin Laden was right. So here we are in this Orwellian inversion that makes this accessible about why it's not just about Jews. But if I go back to that sort of anecdotal sort of story that I wanted to share with you, there were these point of view videos. They were like Holocaust porn, where 16 to 24-year-olds got to dress up as Holocaust, not survivors. They weren't going to be survivors. They were going to be annihilated in the Holocaust. And that was the engagement on TikTok. It was sort of a point of view video that you could make. Now, the understanding that I had in the engagement with TikTok at the time was not shutting down the 16 to 24-year-olds that I know are actually engaging in Holocaust denial. Because they not only don't know that they're engaging in Holocaust denial, they don't know what the Holocaust was. And so instead, what this is and what IRA becomes is a resource. So just like you have to click through when you have violated some other community standards or guidelines online, you would click through and have to click through the IRA and be told, well, we just want you to know you have just engaged in Holocaust denial according to the IRA definition. And do you know what the Holocaust was? Because that's what the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance was created to do, precisely that, so that never again actually has some meaning. Never again to anybody, by the way. That is a really good example of lowering this immediate fear of using the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism and what does it mean for free speech. And, and I often say again, because I'm a single standard girl, well, if you define any other form of hate but not anti-Semitism, and you're not worried about the impediment to free speech when it comes to any other form of hate, only anti-Semitism, then we do have a problem, right? That's a good old double standard. It's exactly what happened with the university president hearing, where really what I would have asked, and I actually briefed that committee the very following day, and I told them this, and I would have asked it very explicitly. Could you call for genocide of any other group on your campus? And not violate your codes of conduct? Because if you can, and we're equalizing, leveling the playing field, then okay. But the answer is you could not call for the genocide of any other group without violating the codes of conduct of universities today. We understand that. And all we are asking for is for the equal and consistent application of principles, recognizing that double standards in the application of any principle, any rule, any law undermines the entire principle, rule, or law, whether it's in the international institutions, in the university spaces, or the social media spaces. So that was a very long answer to say that the first tool that we have is the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. It takes us through a couple of hoops that I think we have to jump through. The first being that we have to recognize that anti-Zionism is this modern strain of anti-Semitism, and actually that brings me to exactly why we're here today. I would much rather reclaim Zionism before I have the IHRA conversation, meaning I want to define my identity. I don't want hate to define my identity. And the understanding that reclaiming Zionism has to tell the story, which when I say to students, invariably, you know, I'm a member of an indigenous people. Depending on where I am, if I'm in Canada, let's say, usually students say to me, you can't say that. And I say, no, I'm a member of an indigenous people. I can prove it to you. I'm a member of an indigenous people that speaks the same language and traverses the same land and reads the same book and practices the same customs and rituals for thousands of years. That's what indigeneity means. But that has been taken away from us. In many ways, we've allowed it to. I'm not saying, you know, there's no boogeyman, but we do have to reclaim it. And if that's what Zionism becomes, what this generation understands, sort of reclaiming identity, and when I make that accessible to younger generations who are in progressive spaces where everybody gets to self-identify. And if you can sit up a little bit, you know, sort of more proudly to say, I know what my identity is, and you are entitled to your identity, but you can't deny me mine, then we're having a completely different conversation from that moment on. And there is an incredible generation of young people out there. We see it in Israel. They're heroes. There has not been a generation that has been challenged to this degree, I'm going to say since the Yom Kippur War, and probably even more, in the challenge that this generation is facing. But there's an incredible generation of young people here as well. And in many ways, we have to equip them with, I say that they're boots on the ground in this raging unconventional war for public opinion, but we have to equip them with the tools to be able to fight in the trenches. And in that sense, I think that reclaiming identity from a positive sense then enables to drill down in the conversation with regards to then defining anti-Semitism and why it is that we have to identify and combat anti-Semitism comprehensively without allowing some strains to run rampant while addressing the other strains. That is important. It's not that it's not important. They don't disappear, as we know from COVID. But it's not effective if we allow the new strain to infect our societies, our places, our spaces.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, some of the work has to do with creating this standard for those on the outside, almost, right? Adopting this definition.
It exists.
It exists, but adopting it and then adding it even from like a compliance perspective, right?
Absolutely.
And I know there's organizations who do that, like Cyberwell out there, who hold some of these companies really accountable to their own
policies. That's right.
So that sounds like very tangible and like very very clear. And like, I mean, I'm going to say something. It's absolutely not true. That's like the easy thing, right? Like just adopt.
You're right.
If you start there, if you can identify any doctor, right? You have to first identify the sickness in order to administer the correct.
Precisely.
So that sounds like incredibly, very, very tangible. And then you're also saying, but internally, right, there's a second piece here. And this is where I find myself personally, and I'm actually curious to hear your thoughts on this as well, is like I haven't given up. It's not that I didn't give up on like the fight against anti-Semitism, right? It's an incredibly important one. But it's been going on for so long, and we basically tried everything, right? And nothing has worked. So I'm like, are we missing something? Is the world telling us something that we're not paying attention? And therefore, we should double down internally. Because I think part of it, certainly the way you're describing it, and I think this is where it connects, is that you can we can self-justify and convince and adopt these, but like if we don't have the it's not what's what I'm looking for. It's where my English and Hebrew kind of mix. But it's confidence, right, and our sense of security in our own and comfortable in our own skin and who we are. Then the rest of it doesn't matter, right? Like going back to that in the UN, the adoption of Zionism equals racism. Like if Herzog couldn't get up there and tear it, like he had to feel something internally to be able to. That's like such a
for us, the Jewish people, right?
Yeah.
This is just a piece of paper.
It's just a piece of paper. Like that, like the levels of chutzpah to do that, right, and self-confidence, and this belief in the righteousness of our ways, something that I know many have it, and I think more have it now post actually October 7th. And then the question becomes, then how do we double down on that and create that? Because I think that part of what we're missing, is this expectation that when folks arrive at college campus when they're 18, we kind of neglect the first 18 years, and then we expect them, we kind of assume that they feel the same level of commitment that maybe parents do. And just like, why aren't you showing up and fighting? And they're like, well, it was never important to us, et cetera. So I don't think meeting it at the campus is important, but the way you said of like, if we can start with reclaiming Jewish identity earlier, right, and kind of figuring out what that means, that will go a long way in or getting us to a position where we can at least fight for our self. So I find that very, very resonant, and I'm like, so how does, so in your role, so there's the kind of the super level of like the envoys and the legislators and and then is part of that also like carrying that message to communities, or is there also like, here's how we're going to incentivize it. Here's our plan to help you implement that. Is there? So
I think that first of all, we've been in emergency mode since the beginning of this role, and actually what I have felt, and the reason that I keep getting on the plane and in meeting with legislators and meeting with law enforcement mechanisms and meeting with mayors, I also ensure that I meet with local leadership, student and otherwise, and organizational, obviously. It is that you said before, Israel hasn't for very long had this role of Israel's Special Envoy for Combating Antisemitism. And part of what I try and make accessible is that I am the State of Israel, Special Envoy for Combating Antisemitism, but the State of Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. So I'm your Special Envoy for Combating Antisemitism. And while we are in the midst of a tsunami, we are going to be able to get through this together. And that's the first part of the conversation, 100%, and it's very important for me. The Jewish communities around the world also know that they're not alone, not in San Francisco, not in Washington, not in New York, not in Montreal, not in Berlin, not in literally every community around the world, with its differences, obviously, because each geography has its differences. But at the end of the day, when you strip away the differences, the responses to 10-7 have this deep similarity in where I'm getting to, in its anti-Zionism, in the negation of Israel's very right to exist. And where does that intersect with everything we've just said? Look, Zionist, the word Zionist, is code for Jew. It's code for Jew online. Now, I have that language, not because I'm technologically apt, I'm not, but I understand and I know what my own Twitter or Facebook feed looks like with Zionist coding Jew and other people's. I know what happens on Jewish businesses around the world with the word Zionist just replacing Jew. I know what happens in demonstrations on campuses and on the streets with the word Zionist replacing Jew. Now, nobody is asking the Jew if they self-define as a Zionist. So basically, this actually breaks my heart a little bit, but once again, the hate, if you will, that has mutated is presenting itself to us and saying, it doesn't matter if you decide to shed your Zionist pound of flesh to be a good Jew. We will still hold you to be a Jew. If you are a Zionist, if you have a Jew or you're a Jewish business owner, we will still target your Jewish business and deface it with the word Zionist and calling, I think that was right here in San Francisco, and calling to kill the settlers, right? It doesn't matter what you think of Judea, Samaria, or the West Bank and how you call it. That's the call to action in 10-7 and the responses to 10-7 that I think we have to make accessible, right? The understanding that, I'll use another example. I use the Emmett Till example when I speak to American audiences. Emmett Till's mother makes the decision to bury Emmett in an open casket. And she does so in order for everybody to see, literally, visually see, what it is that sparks the social justice movement, right? And she does so at a great price to her own family, to her own community. What 10-7 did, and actually what the State of Israel made the decision to do, and I remember the day that I began to sort of deliberate with myself, were we going to be doing the right thing? When I realized we're going to have to prove that families were burned and that women were raped. No other people have to prove it, right? We believe you, right? Where's that? And here we were making this decision to open up the casket. To open up the casket so that the world, civilization, if you will see what this 10-7 war of barbarism versus civilization looks like. But that's effective only if people look in to the casket. If we make, and I'm telling you that I was heartbroken over this because it afflicts great trauma and pain on us, on the families, on the individuals. I can't look at the 47-minute movie. I have seen snippets of what there is to see, and then I can't breathe for days after that, never mind speak publicly. But if we've decided to afflict that pain on ourselves, as did Emmett Till's mother, and the response will be not either to not identify that there is a person in that casket, to look and say, that's not me, that's a Jew, that's a Zionist, that's not me. Or to look away and say, we don't believe you. Forget that we believe you. Me too, unless you're a Jew. That is a moment of reckoning for many places and spaces that actually make the decision either not to look or not to see themselves in that person, or rip down the posters of the hostages, right? Rip down the poster of a 1-year-old baby. Where's my sense of hope? Is that when you see people on the street looking at the people ripping down those posters saying, what are you doing? That's a poster of a 1-year-old baby that has spent a quarter of his life, God willing he's alive, in dungeons and tunnels of hell of a genocidal terror organization. Or they don't even know that. They just say, why are you tearing down a picture of a baby? And the people that are tearing down those posters don't see a human baby there. They see whatever it is that they see us as in that demonized Zionist is racist, Israel's apartheid, and perpetrating genocide. But the others that are watching this recognize, and I think that this is a very important moment of transcending and reaching across difference and creating or recreating allyship with those that actually are committed to social justice and that recognize that if social justice or human rights have been weaponized to exclude one minority, they're not going to be able to protect any minority or any other group. And so in that sense, I think that there is a tremendous sense of responsibility for additional action that this leads to beyond the IRA. And I'll say one more thing. If we are convinced that Zionist codes Jew, and I know it does, and I can prove it. Actually, we can prove it, by the way, now technologically too, that Zionist codes Jew. Then that means that we have not just the top-down IRA, adoption and implementation of IRA, and implementation is a whole other conversation, as you said, holding to account and ensuring and transparency of algorithm of policy of implementation, but also a bottom-up mechanism that's so simple. If Zionist codes Jew, then protected characteristics on social media spaces, and there's a whole list of protected characteristics, just has to include Zionist. That's it. It can't be any simpler to have something so tangible. And educational resources or DEI officers have to be made very, very clear in those training programs that if Zionist codes Jew and Zionist is a legitimate identity like all other identities, we're going to have to protect Zionist in order to apply DEI infrastructure equally and consistently. So there are many tangible tools that I think derive from this moment. I will go back to my sense of duty and responsibility that the first step we have is for us to reclaim our identity, reclaim our story. Our story doesn't fit the story of dividing the world into oppressed and oppressor and us being the oppressor. I am not white. I say that to people all the time. I am the granddaughter of grandparents from Iraq who, along with 850,000 Jews from Arab lands in Iran, were actually ethnically cleansed. So I don't fit the story that everybody has placed on me. And reclaiming our story in that sense is a very empowering. We called it, if you're going to be the boots on the ground, then you have to have the tools to fight the war. That's the tool. Reclaiming your identity and knowing your own story. And by the way, what that does is also shift the conversation to education. And we have spent all these years and resources and curriculum and programs and centers. And there is a moment of reckoning for those spaces too. Not just Jewish education, obviously the university spaces, high school and elementary school, again, not just Jewish, but certainly for us to be able to say, and I have people saying to me, I have sent my kids to 12 years of Jewish education and to Birthright and to Jewish camp, and they're still standing in the demonstrations that are calling from the river to the sea without understanding what it is that they're saying. They don't know that they're calling for the annihilation of the state of Israel. Well, that's a wake-up call for us, isn't it? Right? The understanding that from the river to the sea and from the north to the south, that's the whole thing. That doesn't really go hand in hand with wanting the two-state solution or peaceful resolution to any kind of conflict. That is something that I think takes us back to, in many ways, moments of reckoning in the various spaces that we've identified as lacking. And the educational one is a huge one. And that's true outside of Israel, vis-a-vis Israel and identity. It's also true inside Israel, by the way. So I used to say to my own kids were born in Canada, and I used to say all the time, if my kids know that they have peers their ages, doesn't matter where, in a sister city, right? Montreal was Beersheba, I think San Francisco might be Haifa.
Yeah.
So the understanding that there are kids all over the world who know that they have peers their age in Israel, for me, at 75 years young, what it has to look like for Israelis is the understanding that when you're in first grade and second grade in Israel, you too know that you have peers your age everywhere around the world, and that your reclamation of the notion of peoplehood is that two-way bridge that we need to be creating in this conversation.
Yeah. So that's a whole other, at least, that's a whole side of other conversation of like, how do we educate to that? How do we create those bridges in an earlier, or that consciousness really in an earlier stage? And there's a lot, there's so much more to unpack about why younger Americans are, finding their way, finding themselves in these situations. And there's education, there's context, and there's culture, and there's zeitgeist, and all these things that play into it. But what I find, hopeful in this moment is I think that there is a realization that we're in it together, and that we have agency. And to me, I think that's the big piece of Zionism, where people, people don't, I'm like, do you think Jews have the right to determine who they are, where they want to live, and how they want to live? Yes, you're a Zionist. Welcome.
And for thousands of years, we couldn't have said that,
exactly.
Right? And we've proven that we actually can do it,
yeah.
right, in Israel.
Yeah.
And we've proven that we can do it in the rest of the world.
Yes.
And I agree with you about the agency, and I'll say one word about hope. And I quote the late Rabbi Sachs in his differentiation between optimism and hope in that context. Because hope, and Rabbi Sachs differentiated and said, optimism is the belief that everything will be okay, but hope is the belief that together we can make it okay. So in that sense, optimism is a very passive virtue, and hope is a very active one. And it takes not very much courage to be an optimist, but a great deal of courage to have hope. I think that that's the moment that we're in, a moment that requires action and courage, and you're 100% right. I couldn't agree more with that word, that is agency. It's the first time in Jewish history, whether individually, collectively, or nationally, where we can rise from the docket of the accused and say, no, you know what? I'm an equal agent in this world as an individual, as a community, as a country. So we saw it in the ICJ with Israel. I actually think it was an incredible moment of Israel rising from the docket of the accused for the first time, perhaps, in our relationship with, ripping up that Zionism is racism resolution and Ben-Gurion's Shmum, and understanding very differently for our generation, our understanding of who we are as equal members in the family of nations said, and if you watch that hearing, it's a very important hearing to watch actually, says not only we deserve, we expect to be treated equally. That requires agency, or the psychology of a people, if you will, that I believe that is the role of our responsibility, very possibly is the first time in our history that we could have felt this kind of we're not going to put down our heads until the tsunami washes over. We're actually going to stand up tall, and we're not going to just accept that there's a tsunami washing over. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to be able to stop the tsunami completely, and I'll maybe just say one more thing about that. In no other form of, whether it's racism or hatred of any other group, LGBTQ+, or do we expect that group to fight the hate against them alone? They can't. It's impossible. When you are the subject of the hatred, you cannot fight that hatred alone. And in that sense, that agency is critical to also, at the very least, expose, and in my real sense of hope, which requires action and courage, it's to build or reclaim intersectionality as well. and to rebuild those or form those alliances that say, of course Jews can't combat anti-Semitism alone. No group can combat the hatred that targets them on their own. But I really do think that this is a tremendous moment, a historic moment, that doesn't minimize the challenge that it presents, the opposite, and it probably only augments the urgency with which we have to treat it. But the existential nature of it is a tremendous wake-up call that I try to make accessible, both in Israel and across the world, certainly in North America. I believe that we can do it. I believe that this is the generation that can do it. And at the very least, we have to try.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us. I really, really appreciate this conversation. It's been inspiring and giving us a little bit of hope and, as we say, avir and shima, to see that there is action and a sense of things that we can achieve in that. So I really do appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And wish you the luck, all the luck in making this happen.
All of us together, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you.